Okay, the next panelist is Radhika Desai. Radhika is a professor in political studies at the University of Manitoba and the author of the recent Geopolitical Economy After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire.
If anybody hasn't received any of these are just, I'm going to be speaking to this little diagram later on, so please set this up. Okay, so I'll just start. What I wanted to say is that I hope that perhaps I will end on a slightly more hopeful note than that has. The scandal of the Western world's foremost economists failing to see capitalism's greatest crisis since the Great Depression, complete with the Queen of England practically committing lèse-majesté herself when she irritably asked the country's most eminent economists why they hadn't seen it coming, was certainly delicious for us socialists and Marxists. Our constant struggle against the idiocy produced by capitalism's paid savants was briefly relieved because they ended up believing it themselves. But such schadenfreude must be tempered, for we face an even greater scandal in our own midst. This crisis should have put socialists and Marxists of all sorts on the ideological offensive, explaining its origins, consequences, and advancing the cause of a transition from such an unjust, unproductive, and crisis-prone system, but it hasn't. The chief reason why is that the very idea of capitalist crises and contradictions, so central to Marx's understanding, are contested by most Marxist economists, and they are usually taken at their word by other Marxists. Most Marxist economists question the validity and relevance of Marx's value theory, saying that it suffers from an alleged transformation problem. For them, capitalism does not suffer from contradictions that regularly lead to crises, certainly not economic ones, this is their way of putting it. Many others question in particular whether capitalism suffers from paucity of demand and whether profits tend to fall over time. A small band of those who retain notions of contradiction and crisis, meanwhile, insist that there is only one fundamental cause of crisis, and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, because the sphere of production is more fundamental than that of production. That of circulation. However, since they believe that Marx's account of it suffered from an alleged transformation problem, they reject it and elaborate models of their own. Underlying such Ricardian Marxist economics lies an unacknowledged acceptance of Say's law, which was also Ricardo's problem, and an assumption that capitalism is and can be a purely economic system, leading, among other things, to a denial of crises and contradictions, and of the centrality of state action, including state action and imperialism, to manage them. Rather than Marxism, they do economics. They call their economics Marxist, as though mere labels could deny the profoundly historical fact that neoclassical economics emerged after Marx and Engels' intervention made political economy, whose pinnacle they represented, useless in legitimizing capitalism, precisely to oppose and deny its root and branch. Such Marxist economics had already led to the failure of Marxists to explain the Great Depression. The most powerful account of it would emerge in the work of a bourgeois economist, John Maynard Keynes, one who was critical of neoclassical economics, the very Trojan horse Marxist economists had wheeled into the Marxist citadel. Today, Marxist economics is preventing Marxists from accounting for the greatest crisis since the Great Depression. However, the resources with which we can build a more accurate and effective understanding of the present crisis do exist. They mobilize Marxist insights not out of any reverence, but because they remain the most powerful understanding of our situation today. And it points beyond the crisis to the sorts of demands that we need to make in this critical conjuncture. As some leading Marxists, such as Mandel or Sweezy, recognized, there are several types of contradictions and crises in capitalism, and now I'm speaking to the little diagram I sent around. As I've argued elsewhere, moreover, there are at least two, so there are different types of crises, and they exist in production as well as in circulation. As I have argued elsewhere, moreover, there are at least two other indispensable spheres of capitalist, indispensable spheres, finance and the nation state, in which crises could arise. In each of these four spheres, moreover, crises can take one of two forms. An intra-class form, that is an intra-capitalist class form arising from the mechanisms of competition, and an inter-class form pitting capitalists and workers against each other. Since value cannot exist without money and capital without finance, credit of course becomes a sphere in which crises can arise. And finally, international competition of nationally organized blocks of capital, whether a small number of them competing for colonies as in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, or a much larger number competing for markets today. And these are also endemic to capitalism. These sorts of competitions used to be understood within the rubric of uneven and combined development, a tradition of thinking which figures rather prominently in my geopolitical economy. Whether any of these 8 types of crises is more fundamental than the others is not immediately clear. Certainly any of these can provide an opening, if an opening were needed, for a transition to socialism. After all, the Russian Revolution took place amid an intra-class geopolitical crisis, the First World War. One can safely say that every major historical crisis is a complex amalgam of more than one of these, and several different crisis mechanisms can be seen successively in the development of any given crisis. With this established, let me lay out some points I consider fundamental to understanding the present crisis. They rely on the analysis of my recent book, but also elaborate it further. The first point is that the present crisis is not global, nor is it one in which the United States sneezes and the rest of the world catches pneumonia, as the widespread modern adage has it. It is a crisis of the advanced industrial world. Nor is it a single crisis. Rather, the bursting of the subprime bubble centered on the United States was the culmination of a series of attempts, all involving international financial flows in one or another form, to avoid the consequences of a crisis of longer standing. In that sense, the present crisis represents the return of a much older one, which was never resolved but only postponed. Moreover, the prolonged nature of the crisis since 2008 in the United States demonstrates that there at least further attempts at avoidance have at least so far not been successful. Europe's vulnerability to the United States-centered crisis laid the foundation of a crisis of the euro in that continent. I consider that to be at least a relatively separate crisis. Japan, meanwhile, has been caught in its own low-growth track of more recent origin. That is to say, it is more recent than the crisis that is returning from a longer historical point of view. But of course, in another way, it is of longer standing from the point of view of the post-2008 crisis in the Western countries particularly. By contrast, a number of emerging economies, preeminently China, but also many others, continue to enjoy robust growth. Thus, in addition to a long history, the crisis therefore also has a distinct geography. In effect, it has a geopolitical economy. The present crisis is a profound one for Western capital and one most hopeful for working classes everywhere and for poorer countries. It is the crisis of the very strategies: neoliberalism, increasing inequality between classes and nations, financialization, privatization, the list can go on, through which metropolitan capitalist classes have imposed heavy costs on these constituencies since the 1980s. Needless to say, this potential has to be, the potential that this crisis represents, the hopeful potential, has to be realized today by political activity at both national and international levels. Today, such activity is marginally more evident at the international level in the activities of the BRICS countries and other emerging economies, for instance. But on both fronts, national and international, they need to be much stronger if the full historical and hopeful potential of the present crisis is to be realized. We can begin to understand the geopolitical economy of the crisis with the help of Robert Brenner's account of the economics of global turbulence. It tells us that the present crisis is rooted in the contradictory geopolitical economy of the long boom, which led to the long downturn. But Brenner's account must also be placed within a fuller geopolitical economy. As I show in my recent book, from the early 20th century, the United States sought to dominate the world economy in explicit emulation of Britain's 19th century dominance. However, with little scope for formal colonization, it settled for replacing sterling with the dollar as the world's money and London with New York as its financial center. There was only one problem with this. The alteration was not merely a scaling down of the British achievement, but an effort to emulate it without its essential basis. Formal colonies had been central to sterling and London's domination, and bereft of any colonies, the United States' attempt to realize this ambition would fail even as they subjected the world to economic, financial, and military instability. US attempts to pursue this ambition colored and in most important respects constrained post-war US policy. precisely when the sharpening of uneven and combined development, and by that I mean simply the struggle of dominant states to preserve their dominance and contender states to challenge it, uneven and combined development meant that other countries, preeminently the recovering economies, whose growth constituted the chief growth story of the post-Second World War period, but also developing ones who were employing combined development of the developmental state. The United States, despite its commitment to maintaining the relative size of its own economy, operated with one hand tied behind its back. It forsook all means of fostering growth, but macroeconomic management, and created an industrial policy which was simply a disguised defense policy. All because it needed to appear to be running an open economy. The US working classes have arguably paid the greatest price for this. The recovery of Western Europe and Japan, though through powerful models of combined development, created the overcapacity and overproduction, which according to Brenner let me rephrase that. They created the overcapacity and overproduction at given levels of demand. This is a very critical proviso, as we shall see, that according to Brenner formed the foundation of the long downturn. And the long downturn persisted because corporations and governments refused to permit what Brenner calls the slaughter of capital values on a scale that would renew robust capitalist accumulation and growth. In rejecting the option of a slaughter of capital values on a sufficiently large scale, Western capitalist classes were perhaps only acknowledging geopolitical economic realities. The one power to do it would face relative diminution in relation to others, something which only the Thatcher government imposed on its economy, and that significantly in the face of strenuous protests against progressive industrial capitalists as well as domestic unrest. Mrs. Thatcher would have actually lost the 1983 election if it hadn't been for the Falklands War. However, the capitalist classes and governments, which would not permit the slaughter of capital values on a necessary scale, also rejected other options for more stable economic growth. One was using the state to attempt to resolve the crisis by increasing demand. This they rejected because it would have strengthened working classes domestically and poor countries internationally. And I discussed this episode in some detail in my book. Another viable option would have been to increase productivity through increased investments in new techniques. This too was rejected, or at least was not possible, whether for fear that capitalist prerogatives would be questioned in a situation when already state intervention was very dominant in the economy, or because the few efforts that were made in this direction were not sufficiently promising. That this may well have been so, this latter possibility may well have been so, is suggested by Robert Gordon's recent work on the historical exhaustion, or the possible historical exhaustion, of the prospects for productivity increases. Western capitalist classes instead use the state to impose greater discipline on the working class, and use the state, and through it the environment, as sources of risk-free profits for themselves, through oligopoly contracts, privatizations, and the famous public-private partnerships, or the infamous public-private partnerships. This approach was most advanced in the UK and the United States, the two countries where past imperial dominance and current attempts to emulate the same constrained economic policies. A certain amount of capital, particularly from these economies, did flow to low-wage countries. However, the importance of these flows is highly exaggerated by those who are too Eurocentric to acknowledge that most industrialization in the developing world is autonomous, that is to say, it does not take place through the agency of Western multinationals. During the long downturn, state-led development and industrialization of many developing countries constituted fresh phases of combined development and exacerbated the problem of overcapacity and overproduction. The long downturn did not constitute a period of uninterrupted and relentless decline. However, phases of growth that did take place in it were part of what Brenner called a hydraulic mechanism, in which exchange rate movements, usually politically managed, opened markets for one or another of the three major centers of capitalist accumulation. Certainly they found it impossible to grow in unison, and did so at one another's expense instead. So I'm now closing soon. The crisis, therefore, now more than 4 decades in the unfolding, combined many crisis mechanisms. To say that the long downturn was the result of overcapacity and overproduction in relation to a given level of demand is to say that it combined both paucity of demand and declining profits as factors. On the one hand, the recovery of Western Europe and Japan and the later entry of the newly industrializing countries and now the BRICS created too much capacity in relation to demand. On the other, within these demand constraints, new investment could not increase productivity enough to lower costs and expand accumulation along new lines. Slowing accumulation led to an expanse of finance everywhere as profits were invested, and I put this in heavy quotation marks because of course financial investment, we use the same term, but they are two completely different things with completely different social and economic consequences. So, these were invested in finance rather than production, but the contribution of the closing of the gold window was possibly even greater to the expansion of the financial sector. Between them, these two factors set the stage for a series of US and dollar-centered financializations, and in my book, I use this term in the plural because we tend to use the word financialization as though it represents some kind of an even increase in financial activity, but in fact, there are a number of discrete episodes of financialization, and of course, different countries participated in these events at at different levels. Okay, so they set the stage for a series of US and dollar-centered financializations in which on the one hand, finance no longer functioned to expand production but to prey upon it. And on the other, increasingly flowed across borders in a succession of different and distinct patterns. Each constituted a distinct financialization and each created, however briefly, a succession of beds of liquidity on which the dollar's world role now came to rest. They would culminate in the stock market and housing bubbles of recent decades. It is noteworthy that the last bubble burst because the rise of emerging economies put pressure on the dollar, forcing the Federal Reserve to increase short-term interest rates about 2004. And a couple of years later also led to a secular rise in long-term interest rates. Finally, geopolitically, the post-war era of decolonization had to replace colonial markets for expanded domestic ones based on working-class consumption. Much as John Hobson had anticipated in his study imperialism as early as 1901, though the US market, which was left relatively open in attempts at imperial mimesis, also played a role. Now competition for these limited markets sharpened as, after 1970s, the world pushed expanding working class and developing country consumption off its agenda for the next several decades. Only the requirements of continued growth in the BRICS after the 2008 crisis and the loss of the US markets has put it back on the agenda, that is expanding consumption in the working classes of the West and poorer countries more generally. This is now back on the agenda. This is possibly the single most important reason for the hopeful potential of the present crisis.